Hello viewers, thanks for tuning in. This is History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms. I'm here with my personal professor, Bob Forrant.
I love that title.
It's my favorite.
Better than professor. Yes, absolutely.
And we have a special guest today, Assistant Professor of Philosophy, correct? Jose Mendoza.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks for coming on. Yes. So, we've been talking a lot about history in Lowell having to do with immigrant history, labor history, all kinds of really great stuff. We got really into the nitty-gritty. We even took a zoomed-in lens on Lowell. And then we started backing out and seeing what was going on the national stage, especially in terms of immigration. So the quotas and the good immigrants and the bad immigrants, refugees, and all kinds of ways that America has been involved in foreign policy to kind of create situations of
Harvest
refugees.
of Empire.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. So, Jose.
Feels like you all covered it already.
No, I feel like we can get a little deeper. You
Okay.
have a whole book here, right?
I do.
So let's start there. Let's tell us about what this book is about, and then we'll go deeper into it.
Well, so what I kind of came to the conclusion, and I don't think this is really original, but what I find is people talk about immigration and they kind of throw facts at each other. They throw numbers at each other and so forth. Some of the numbers are just blatantly wrong, but still they kind of throw facts at each other. And what I thought a lot of the debates were really about philosophical values, values about security, liberty, and equality. And if we don't sort of hash out these debates about these values, then we're just throwing facts at each other and talking past each other. Mm-hmm. I also thought that the way that philosophers were looking at the immigration issue was not helpful. So if you ever watched the show The Good Place, anyway, it's got Ted Danson in it. They've got a moral philosopher on the show.
I love that show.
So yeah, so they do the trolley problem. So now the trolley problem is famous, and the trolley problem says, well, if you have 5 people on one track, and the trolley is going to hit them, and they can't move, and it's going to hit them, and you can move the trolley over to a different track and hit one person, what do you do? So the idea is you have to, if you leave the trolley alone, it kills 5 people, but you do nothing. If you do something, it kills 1 person. So they've kind of run a trolley problem with immigration. It's gotten so abstract. They talk about this unencumbered individual and this completely idealistic, legitimate state. Does this person have freedom of movement, or does this abstract, ideal, legitimate state have freedom of association? And really, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And the other thing I looked at was the ethics of enforcement. Even if we get past the open borders debate, what are the kinds of things you can and can't do to migrants who are, for all intents and purposes, just doing a civil infraction? People don't understand that it's still not a felony to unlawfully cross borders. Can you implement strategies that pretty much force these folks to go into the desert and lead to their death? And so those are the fun things I talk about in that book.
Yeah, see, we haven't covered any of that. We've talked maybe a little bit about values, but no, that I really love the way that you put that. It was,
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a visual learner, so
okay, great.
I love analogies and metaphors.
That's the subtitle of the show.
Analogies and
History
metaphors.
in Lowell, analogies and metaphors.
It totally is.
That's where the linguistics degree comes in.
That's absolutely
That's
correct.
true, yeah.
I mean, so let me throw this out and see where you take it in terms of what you were just talking about. One of the things that we've been grappling with back and forth on the show is how do you educate the larger public that when they say to us or to anybody else, well, my grandparents came legally, right? How do you sort of sort that when up until 1924 in the United States, there wasn't a visa, there wasn't a line. People have this mythical idea that their grandparents or great-grandparents waited in line. And so is that part of the moral, ethical sort of conversation you have with immigration, or how do you reply to somebody like that says, well, my people did it properly?
And so one of the things I mentioned in the introduction, and then I get into the philosophy stuff, but one of the things I mentioned is how the enforcement of national borders are very new, and the kind of weirdness about them. I think it wasn't until 1980 that passports were fully implemented. They started implementing them before in other places, but I think it's in 1980 where they sort of become official. So this passport that we now take for granted that you have to cross borders doesn't really come into being until 1980. Most people are surprised to learn that even after all those restrictions in 1924 and so on, it wasn't until 1965 that you get restrictions in the Western Hemisphere. So you essentially had open borders with Mexico. I mean, you'd have to show up. You still had to kind of say, I'm coming in. And then there was parts in the history that are awful. They just kind of want to make sure you weren't from China or something, trying to sneak in. But yeah, I think when you talk to people and show them the history, people tend to think that the world is the way it is right now and has always been this way.
Yes.
And so I think when you see how constructed certain things are and that things had been otherwise, then you start thinking that it's possible they could be otherwise. And it's hard for me to imagine a good and just world where you have more and more walls, more and more border guards. That starts to seem like a dystopia to me. So when I think of what a just world would look like, it's going to be a world where you have less of that. Right? We don't have border folks between Massachusetts and New Hampshire, for example. I mean, could you imagine if you got a job in New Hampshire? Someone says, I want to hire you, Bob, and you say, I want to work for you. They think you're the best person for this job. And, New Hampshire says, well, we're not going to let you come in. It's very
Need
bizarre.
a checkpoint.
Yeah, it's
Checkpoint, New Hampshire.
yeah, that's right. So it's weird how borders work, and really we only come to see them when they really affect us. And I think, with the exception of Germany, our passport gets us free into like 140 some countries, whereas if you were born in, say, in Afghanistan, your passport might only get you into 20 countries. So you've got this sort of tiered level of humanity of who can and can't cross these borders, and yet crossing these borders can make all the difference for your life expectations. And so you've got a global caste system is what you have.
Right, and it's tied then to the earlier debate in this country about good immigrants
Absolutely.
and bad immigrants, which was really tied to the way people looked, the color of their skin, the part of the world that they came from, the language that they spoke. And I feel like a lot of the president's rhetoric now harkens back to the sort of way people made the arguments in the 1920s about people use terms like race suicide.
Right.
If we don't let Nordics in, but we let all these other people in from Southern and Eastern
Correct.
Europe, we're going to pollute the gene pool, and we're going to end up with an enfeebled society. And I mean, it's sort of like, how do you have, for people that like fully believe that, I try to imagine like how you would construct an argument that would persuade them, no. It seems like if you hold on to that.
Right. I mean, in some ways, immigration touches all these issues.
Right.
And in some ways, even if you rationally tell someone, you can convince them this is the right policy to have for immigration. I think what you're getting at, there are other underlining worries and concerns that sort of manifest themselves. So I'm not trying to say that the immigration problem is like this epiphenomenon, but in some ways, a lot of the problems that are quote unquote immigration problems are really symptoms of other problems. And this relates back to Harvest of Empire and these other things. When you go and you intervene in certain countries, like in Central America, that's going to have an effect later on.
Right.
And so in some ways, you end up with an immigration problem, but really that immigration problem is symptomatic of these other things. And so it's going to be hard to solve the quote unquote immigration problem without doing justice in all these other areas, if that makes some sense. And it's hard. I think it's hard to conceive of that. It's hard to think that our tax dollars have done bad things in other parts of the country, because we're good people. I meet people on the street every day, and never do I meet someone who says I'm an awful person. Right? And so this idea that their country or that their tax dollars or that they're in some way, being a part of an unjust global system just doesn't dawn on them. And they also think, I work hard, and how can I be a bad person?
I pulled myself up from my bootstraps, Jose. What do you mean?
That's right. I think most people do work very hard, but we also don't see some of the advantages that are kind of built into the fact that we were born to a specific set of parents or born in a particular country, and that kind of global head start that just that birthright gave us. And no one wants to think of having birthrights, but citizenship is a global birthright.
Yeah.
And
The luck of the draw,
it is,
so to speak.
It is. And I think immigration is sort of the tip of the iceberg, because if you have those conversations with them, Bob, and you convince them enough, and then so slowly all this other historical stuff I think starts to unravel,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a scary thing when you've got kind of a narrative about yourself in a certain way.
Well, because it destroys a whole system that you believe in, that
Correct.
you live your life in, and nobody ever asks the questions: who created these policies in the first place? What were the circumstances? And like we always say, obviously nobody else is studying history, because if you knew and you understood the circumstances, you might be questioning these things too. Where did these policies even first begin? When did we first even have green cards? These are things that, I would like to know the answers to, but I have my own personal professor that I can ask.
Well,
Most people aren't seeking this
no.
information.
I mean, to keep plugging my book, in the first chapter, what I point out, and people do need to understand, is the right to exclude people is called plenary. It's called the plenary power doctrine. That's why the federal government has the power to exclude. It's not in the Constitution. It comes from case law. The most important cases that give the government the plenary power are the Chinese exclusion cases. Those are still in the books. So the Chinese exclusion acts are gone. Congress has repealed them, but the statutes passed by the Supreme Court are still in effect, and that's how this right to exclude is justified. It's justified on racist Supreme Court cases. And if you know that, that should bother you.
Right.
Maybe their reasoning is correct, but it should worry you that the reasoning that got used was to defend a racist system.
Yeah, now we have stacked up in a way all these folks in the world, millions and millions and millions of people that every day are in motion. And we don't, sitting in Lowell, people come and go in Lowell, new people come, other people leave, and the demographics of Lowell change. But we sometimes, I think, lack this larger global perspective. And if you have an immigration system where right now people are supposed to show up at an embassy if they want to, quote unquote, legally immigrate, get on a list, get a visa, sort of make the move, right? And the waiting time in many countries to do that is a decade or more.
Yep.
Then we have another whole group of people, millions and millions of people who have been displaced by war, by climate change, by any number of other things that are supposed to do the same thing. They may be in a refugee camp where there are people in Lowell that have come in the last decade that spent the first 20 years of their life in a refugee camp. And we lack, I think, some perspective on that. And then we have a whole bunch of people, again, another millions and millions, like these buckets of people, and these millions of people that are in countries with either religious persecution or gang violence or drug wars or whatever it might be, trying to get asylum. And a lot of what's happened in the U.S. in the last few years is people trying to get out of Central American countries and come through. And it's easy for me to say, well, people should just get in line and do it legally. But getting in line and doing it legally mortgages your life.
Right.
And so again, it's sort of your trolley question, right? There's a ethics there, right? Of, do I say, well, they should just do it the way everybody else did it 150 years ago. 150 years ago, there weren't 100 and some odd million people waiting in these long lines,
Right.
and watching their life and their children's lives disappear before them. So I challenge people sometimes in my neighborhood in Lowell to say, well, if your kid was starving, and the way that you were going to save that kid is put that kid on a bus or put them in a caravan of people walking, hoping to get to the image of the United States that they see on TV, would you let your kid starve, or would you put your kid in the line moving toward the United States in hopes they might be fortunate and get over? And most people would say, well, I would obviously not want my kid to starve, but then they can't generalize it and have empathy for other people, right? I assume in the moral and political philosophy there's room for empathy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it any better. I think that's right.
We should write a book together.
We should.
I want to read it.
We should. I think a lot of understanding immigration now is understanding history and having some empathy. We might need someone who does some psychology too, to sort of, as you said, it's not that folks are dumb. People get it and they follow the reasoning, and then there's kind of a hang up. Something happens. Maybe like I said, my theory is that it must be that once we start getting to that level, then we start it's not just immigration anymore. It becomes an issue of sort of global injustices and how do we solve them, and it gets pretty scary. I mean, once we start saying, well, these climate refugees, it's not that they just are just wanting to come to Lowell or wherever. It's that they can no longer live in the areas where they are now because of climate change. And then we start saying, well, what shouldn't they maybe have the right to stay home? I want to say Kevin Bacon, but I think that's the author. I think that's the actor. Maybe it's not Bacon. He wrote this. This last name is Bacon. The first name is escaping me. He wrote a book called The Right to Stay Home, and he looks at immigration from a different perspective. What would it take for folks to do what they want to do, which is actually stay home? And it gets pretty scary. I mean, part of that's going to be dealing with global warming, and how do we deal with that? So there could, and I don't know. I think we need a psychologist. But what happens, or why do people shut off and suddenly say I'm not dealing with this? You stay over there.
It's almost like a decompartmentalization, like
it might be, but again, that's above my pay grade. Right? but that's what I feel like, but I don't know.
Well, I see it all the time, even like on social media, right, where people are like, "Oh, I would do anything for my kids," but these are genuine people who are doing whatever they have to do for their children. Right. And I also don't see the disconnect. I also don't see how you can take kids, you can see them in a cage, you can see the conditions that they're living in and be okay with it. When folks see the images that are coming from the border right now, and I know you were down there close by.
Yeah, I crossed, and when I crossed from El Paso to Juarez, you see sort of the little tent area there, and they try to cover it, but you can still kind of see in, and it's. I mean, it looks like people are hanging out, but then when you stop and think about the fact that they've been there for months, it's
some years, right?
Yeah, well, now it's going to be years, and I mean, these things were just sort of makeshift, and I think it was not this summer, but the summer before, really. Yeah, so now we're getting into years. Yeah, and I went to some shelters that they have on the Mexican side. Talked to this guy who, he made a mistake when he was a teenager, and he. Did something stupid, paid the penalty for it, and now in his 30s has his own auto repair business. But because of this new crackdown, they were going after quote unquote immigrants with criminal records who weren't he wasn't a citizen yet. He had a green card, and they've deported him. And he's got 2 girls here, and he's got no way of coming back. And yeah, he made a mistake in his teens, but so. You have a wide range of folks who are getting deported, and each of these are human beings, and it's gut-wrenching. I mean, it's just, especially for folks like him who have set roots down in the United States.
Right.
So.
Right, and then the misnomer that connects to all of that is somehow those folks aren't paying taxes, aren't paying into Social Security, or just getting free stuff.
Right.
And the idea that if somebody is able to come from a refugee camp, if they come to Lowell, they get a free house. Right, people actually will tell me that. Right. Well, people get a free house. And I say, no, people don't get a free house. They get a small stipend, and they have to find an apartment and everything else under that budget through the International Institute here in Lowell. And then within a half a year to a year, they have to be economically self-sufficient.
Right.
And so I say to them, imagine now you're dropped down in the middle of Iraq, and you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know anything about the place, and in a year you're going to be self-sufficient. Go knock yourself out. And they said, well, I could never do that. And I said, well, what's the difference, right?
Right.
And again, for me, it's part of, at least when I'm teaching immigration history, we come to these moments in the history where the other, whoever that might be in the historical moment, becomes a scapegoat for all these other ills in society that people are genuinely feeling. And so when the economy crashes in the United States in the 1870s, in the 1890s, there's backlash against newcomers, and newcomers are an easy target to blame. If it wasn't for them, we would be okay.
Right.
So we have to get rid of them. And the bigger question of the economy and jobs and who's calling the shots gets missed, and we fall for it. And historically, it seems to me like at all these different moments we've fallen for it, and we want to blame somebody else. And I feel like we're in that same kind of period now with a lot of the way people are thinking about immigration. I get caught with trying to figure out, okay, so how do we fix this. And sometimes, as a historian, seeing these things over, and it seems like every 25 years there's another group to blame. But then the group that got blamed in the previous era becomes the blamer backwards into the next era. And it's like, wait, people did that to you.
Well, you see this in Florida. I mean, some of the folks who voted for Trump are part of the Cuban community. People who came here trying to get away from Cuba, and now they're backing policies that keep other people out. Yeah, so it's
And here's where my linguistics degree comes in. The language. If you don't understand these policies, if you don't understand what you're voting for, and they do it on purpose. I do remember that class. They put words in there that makes it sound good, and it's like, yeah, I think this is what I want. I think this is what I'm voting for, but nobody understands it, and the language becomes more and more complicated, more convoluted, and you can't read through it, and so nobody's really researching policies when they're voting. Nobody's really doing that unless you're like one of my best friends who studied policy and is like a huge nerd about it. Nobody's doing that. And then it becomes, again, the question of who's making these decisions? Who is allowing these things to be signed into law, and who's backing them, and where does the money come from? It's always my next question.
Yeah, I mean, in the last big reform in immigration law and policies in the 1980s, and interestingly, it's under a very conservative Republican president, Ronald Reagan, and he takes a look at that moment in the 80s and says we have to create a path. It's interesting. We have to create a pathway to citizenship for several million people who are already here. It's not going to be effective in any way to try to figure out how we send those people out. And he creates pathways for citizenship for what ends up being close to 10 million people, and allows then, as they're becoming citizens, family reunifications.
Right.
And that's what changes a lot of the composition of where people are who's coming and which part of the world they're coming from. But when, again, you try to talk to people about that history, I'll say this and they'll say, nah, that couldn't have happened, right? Because it's so out of character now for thinking that a Republican could have done such a thing. And in many respects, it only was a Republican that could have done it, right? Because it seemed more like, a Democrat would have been seen as just, getting more voters or whatever it would be, the way it is now. But I look at that history and try to understand, what was going on in that moment, different from what's going on today, and I can't for the life of me figure it out.
Yeah.
But here we still sit, right?
Yeah.
It seems like people are really attached to their identities more now than ever, like the nationalism and even the figmentary borders that we want to make them real, build real walls. Where does that come from? Where does that nationalism come from, that patriotism that we can't have anybody else here and we're so great, but also we need to be more secure, put those walls up. Where does that come from? Where do those things come from? And obviously these are not necessarily answers that we can answer, but
in the next 7 minutes.
Yeah, no, I don't know. But as you were saying, Bob, you see this sort of, it's interesting when it pops up, with the Know Nothing Party, and then there'll be these moves towards being a much more cosmopolitan.
Right. 1850s, 1870s, 1890s, 1920s, you get this incredible backlash.
And I don't know. I don't know if it's fear. Again, we might need a psychologist to come in and tell us, is it fear that then, so you rally around this national identity, this sort of, insecurity, yeah.
And yet, in Lowell, again, as a sort of historical example, it goes to this question of climate change and whatnot. There's this big volcanic eruption on one of the Portuguese islands in the Atlantic, Lowell, in the late 1950s. And the quota system would exclude people from the island whose lives have been totally disrupted from leaving. And Portuguese immigrants in Lowell write a letter to then Senator John F. Kennedy and say, can you relax the quotas and let my people go?
Yeah.
Literally, right? This letter to Kennedy. And Kennedy sponsors a bill in Congress, pushes it through to relax the quotas and let as many Portuguese as possible off the island of Lowell, and many of them end up in Lowell.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? And so there's that sort of climate, that's all wrapped up in one. There's humanitarianism, there's climate, because the earthquake is the volcano, excuse me, is a climate-related, environmentally related disaster, and people in the late 50s, early 60s said, yeah, it makes sense for us to do that, and they did it. And there's a headline in the Lowell Sun at the time, first volcano family arrives.
Oh, wow.
Right? And nobody, like, I've read the newspaper accounts of that, nobody is like flipping out, like, oh my God, we're gonna like ruin the country if we let these Portuguese refugees, because literally they are refugees,
Right.
in, and we do it. And the Senate and the House relax the quota, and we go on our merry way, and nobody bats an eyelash.
The infrastructure didn't burn down.
Yep.
Crime didn't go up.
Yep.
That might be another connection we should make, going back to your question about why are people so nationalist. I don't think I've gotten an answer, but the other thing that I sort of have noticed in this era more than anything else, and especially if you read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, is just that we are in an era of mass incarceration in the United States. And so I think the two are somehow related. And or at least the general feeling. We tell people that we have over 2 million people in prisons. The fact that people aren't just shocked by that, I find shocking.
Highest rates of incarceration.
We do, yeah. And it wasn't like it's slowly ramped up. You can look at, like, our prison population. It's somewhat steady, hits the 80s, and it just spikes up.
It's like the documentary we watched, the 13th.
13th is a great, and I think you see it as we were talking about with the way they're holding these women and children in prisons, basically. These people seeking asylum. These things are sort of coming together, and I wonder what. It's not unrelated that people feel afraid or insecure. That sort of leads to this kind of xenophobia and leads to policies that create mass incarceration.
And then we're back to from some people in Congress, the idea of let's reinvestigate birthright citizenship.
Oh yeah,
right, which comes out of the end of the Civil War, and now let's go back and maybe we can do. I mean, that I shouldn't say it out loud. I mean, I can't imagine that actually is ever going to get massive traction and happen. The idea that you would repeal, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but there's certainly some argument, that's being made particularly by the president and people around him. Well, we have to reinvestigate this whole question of birthright citizenship. We have to reinvestigate this question of family reunifications and whether we should create, if we're going to allow more people in, if we should have this hierarchy that has nothing to do with things like family reunification, even though his wife's family came
sponsored,
to he was sponsored through family reunification.
Very recently, sponsored parents. That was kind of
they got their
very
citizenship
ironic.
like maybe 2 years ago, right? So it's okay. Again, it's sort of all these things get jumbled, and then we lose the thread. And I'll go on immigration history walks in Lowell, and we'll go over by St. Patrick's, and I'll talk about how Protestants wanted to burn down a Catholic church in the 1840s, and people went, no, that didn't happen. Yeah, it did. It's in the history, and so it was all driven by fear of Catholics. Yeah. Right? The same way fear of Muslims. Right? I mean, there's these teaching history I love, but sometimes teaching history I want to bang my head against, right? Because I'm sure you feel the same way in grappling with these philosophical questions. Because why are we doing this again?
And again,
right?
and again.
Can't we move on to a more significant question? Why are we always in a redo?
Right.
Yes. And where does the fear come from? And why are we still trying to manifest this destiny that seems to just be trampling over everyone else? But gentlemen, we are at that point where we are out of time, and so we will have to keep pondering these questions.
Yeah, we've not answered one of them.
No, we didn't answer a single one.
No.
We had fun.
We did, and I definitely want to read your book because my brain is swirling now with different thoughts about immigration and policies, and even just like white supremacy and colonialism, and I just need to get back into school. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in to History in Lowell.